Hi everyone, this is Michael Jeffries, and I'm here with Aidan Pickering, and today we're going to look at a wonderful game where he beat a master with the black pieces.
Well, yes, his name's Sargis Hakobyan. He was an expert at the time, but he's since become a master. This was at a time when I was just getting back into tournament play, so it was good to get the scalp of an expert.
Okay, so you had the black pieces, and the name of your opening was?
Well, it was the Robatch, or the modern, and it employed a very modern theme, actually, in that opening, although my motivation at the time, frankly, was to get out of book as quickly as possible because I was just getting back into playing tournaments and felt a little bit nervous playing against good opposition and getting into a well-known opening line.
Okay, well this game was played back in 2005 in October at the LHS Club, and it was game in 25, so you didn't have a whole lot of time to think.
Game 30, I think.
Game in 30. Okay, here we go. So E4 by Sargis, and you responded with G6.
Right.
And so obviously a modern type opening.
Right.
And he grabs the center with D4. You play bishop to G7. Knight to C3. A6, is that just to keep the knight out of B5?
Well, it's an idea where basically the classic thing is to turn it into a Pyrrhic, and go D6 and move the knight out and castle king's side. The idea here is you expand fast on the queen side and you kind of leave the king side alone, and you do not castle, so that you don't subject yourself to the classic bombardment down the king side that usually follows with a...
Right, like an Austrian attack or
exactly.
something like that. Okay, so he puts a stop to it. He plays A4 right away.
So he's going to come meet me on the queen side, which I'm happy about.
Okay. E6, and that makes a little square for your king's knight, which will go to E7.
E7.
And he played knight F3, just classical development.
Right.
And there it is, knight E7. And you were telling me before we started taping that the knight has to go to E7 in this line.
It's not a good idea to put it on F6 because it'll get pinned and then that E-pawn will push forward and you're in trouble. So this is a case where the knight goes to E7. It can be protected by the other knight going to C6. And you get a fairly solid little setup. But it's a little cramped.
Okay, so white continues, just normal developing, bishop to E3. And here you expanded in the center with pawn to D5.
Right.
And he pushed past, pawn to E5.
So I'm giving him some squares. I'm letting him have some space here.
Right, so now we have a locked center, a closed center. So we know that the fight's going to go on the wings.
Right.
Knight D7, developing.
In some ways, it actually resembles a French defense more than a modern.
Yeah, it's a French with a fianchetto king's bishop.
Right.
And B4, so here we go. H6, bishop to D3, developing, and C6, A5, pawn to A5, and B5. So it's really getting locked up over on the queen side. White castles.
And right around here, I had an idea. Originally, I figured that either I'd leave the king in the center or I would castle king side, standard way, and try to weather the storm. Right now, though, I changed my mind completely. And I think it's an important lesson in chess to read the situation, look at the moves, and change plans in midstream if it's to your advantage. And so what I decided here was I'm going to castle queenside. And the reason is the pawn structure is almost impenetrable. And I think I have a much more of an impregnable fortress on the queen side than I do on the king side. And that also has the added bonus that I'm going to be able to roll my king side pawns forward and attack white's king. The only disadvantage is that my white squared bishop is going to be locked away for a time, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. With these pawns here on A6 and B5 and C6 and D5, it's just solid as a rock. He's just not getting through there.
He's not coming through.
Okay, so bishop to B7, queen D2, and he's just kind of humming along like it's a normal,
And I think he's probably still thinking I'm going to castle on the king side, and he's going to start attacking me. But
right now, this is a case though. One of the reasons queen D2 stops you from castling king side because you drop the H pawn if you castle.
Right. Unless I move the H pawn up.
Right. So queen C7, and now he plays knight E1. Maybe he's thinking about F4.
Yep.
And here you go, triple O.
Triple O, and I'm happy with my position here. I think it's just fine. I like the idea of my kingside pawns rolling forward. I feel my king is nice and safe.
Okay. And F4. There he goes. He's attacking. It's funny there's no king over there, though, which is good for you. So,
And I've got a great square for my knight, too.
don't tell me.
Coming up.
F5.
There you go.
Knight F5. Beautiful, beautiful square for that knight. He drops the bishop back to F2. And now Aidan gets the pawns on the king side rolling. G5. And Sargis took off your knight. Bishop takes.
I'm happy about that.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is things are starting to open up, and this is what I'm looking for. A lot of this is going to revolve around the G pawn and the lines that are going to open up down towards the king.
Okay. Well, if you've ever played Aidan, he does like to attack. There's a little little clue for you if you ever play him. Okay, so pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes the bishop.
And of course, it looks like I'm dropping a pawn here.
Right.
And
this G
this G pawn clearly looks like it's going to go. At this stage, that's a good sacrifice worth making. But there's something else brewing here. And even if I hadn't got the resource that I had, to sack that pawn and to open up the G file down towards the king would be compensation for the pawn.
Yeah, and let's see that, because we're going to see. I'll tell you, that's what I thought when I first saw this game. After pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and in fact, you had a different idea. But let me just go one step further, and we'll come back to it. I honestly thought this was the move,
right,
which is the very natural move,
right, and that looks pretty strong and solid, and it's good attacking possibilities. And I think in many other games, that's kind of what I'd be looking for. But there was something else that suddenly caught my eye that was actually far better, and it was a little combination basically, and it's all based on the D pawn.
Okay.
I'm sorry, on the E pawn. So.
Okay, so this did not happen. Let's go back now and take a look at the game variation. And the reason I've highlighted, if you'll notice, the E5 pawn is highlighted, and also the knight on C3 is highlighted in red, and the H2 pawn. And there's some nice symmetry here that Aidan spotted during the game, in that he can do this wonderful sacrifice that takes advantage of the rook on H8 and this vulnerable pawn on H2, which is really only defended by the king and this knight.
I think a lot of chess is about spotting patterns, and here, as you correctly point out, there are some vulnerabilities, and part of them have really arisen because my opponent opened up the H file, and probably shouldn't have done. But because once that H file is open and that rook comes bearing down on that king, H2 is very dangerous because the queen could checkmate white if it wasn't for that E pawn. So the big question becomes, how do I bust through and get the queen, onto that clear through that diagonal and onto H2? And obviously it requires a sacrifice, and it'll either be the knight or the bishop. But in this case, the bishop works really well because when the queen recaptures,
there we go, queen takes G5.
Right. So you're going to see the bishop recapture that E pawn.
Right, and the problem with knight takes is, as Aidan and I were discussing before we started taping, is he's got queen takes pawn check, and he's also the bishop's hanging. So it does make sense to, if you're going to sack a piece, in this case, the correct sack is bishop takes E5, which you played.